Oh, look guys, another Ultra Kill video.
So last year and during the summer, I tried getting into D&D, or Dungeons and Dragons. You know that thing that people do? Yeah, I tried getting into that, and I unfortunately learned I'm not good at roleplay. I would very much, for half of the sessions I was in, or in campaigns, just sit, zoning out, or drawing. But one of my friends, who would often DM these campaigns, I brought up to him one day, hey, what if we took ULTRAKILL, a game that me and him both like, and turned it into a dick and dick session? And me and him just said basically within the 5-second span of nothing, yeah, you know what, sure, that'd be fun. Anyway, it lasted 2 sessions. There were a lot of reasons as to why it went to shit. One of them was that since all the enemies are custom, one's from ULTRAKILL and one's that me and him made up, we had to make sure that they all had specific stats for every single one. And yeah, no, we didn't feel like doing that, and that's not including like all of the custom enemies we thought of. The other hard part was making like custom weapons and stuff, and like how they would work. And also we had to like, you know, make sure it was balanced. And then the third one is that friend group we were in was a fucking toxic piece of shit, but I don't feel like going into detail about that, so I just put up a few reasons here. You get it, guys? I'm cutting myself off. It's funny. It's totally not making me hard to understand. But anyway, yeah, no, it went to shit, but because I don't want these ideas to rot in my sketchbook and on a Word doc, I'm gonna go and just talk about them, I guess. Well, I can't remember all of the characters' names. Basically, me and 3 other people were playing as the robots. Now, if you've played D&D, you're probably wondering, wait, isn't there multiple species and shit? How does that work? So basically what we did is we just said, hey, whatever your race benefits are, yeah, that's just built into a robot. Your character is actually a robot. And so we had everybody try to make their own robots. Except as far as I'm aware, only one of them made a detailed description. I was not one of those people. I just remembered what my robot looked like in my head and forgot to write it. Basically, my robot, I literally just named it Aiden, but made the I a 1. Yeah, I didn't feel original that day. It was a scrap bot similar to Soar's Machine, but it wasn't Soar's Machine. It wasn't like copying its appearance and shit. I'm only using this model because I physically don't know what to use. He wore like a scarf and like he was a barbarian and shit. Yeah. My one friend actually made a very, 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 very fucking detailed description of what the robot was and what their purpose was in the war. And the whole idea was it was basically a scouting bot. And, yeah, he was like the only person that actually had like a semi-decent physical description. The other friend didn't write any physical description, and I don't have access to the last guy's character sheet, so this is his character. Deal with it. My one friend, who physically wrote nothing, was essentially just a mind flayer with a gun. They had magic powers and shit, which in the campaign's lore was just, oh, hell energy. And, they were probably the most overpowered person in the entire campaign, I'm not gonna lie. The other person,
I don't know, actually.
I'm pretty sure they were very similar to my other friend, but used guns more. That was really about it. And basically the whole campaign is our robots said, hey, you know what, if we work together, we might actually be able to find some blood, you know? Even though the ULTRAKILL lore is very, very heavily hinted at, the machines literally killed each other for blood. But I guess our robots said,
self-preservation? Nah, what's that?
Just like ULTRAKILL, our machines went through the 9 layers of hell. We had to make up the last 2. We did eventually kind of have some ideas for violence once the teaser was out, but by that point, the campaign was already just about 2 centimeters away from kicking the bucket. The whole idea was that V1 was like 1 layer ahead of them, so like by the time they get through Limbo and finally reach Lust, King Minos' husk is already dead from V1. Anyway, let's go ahead and talk about the story, because I literally wrote the entire story for this thing. Correction, my friend also helped. I will give you a warning now. It gets pretty edgy and cringy. I will warn you that now. Also, I'd like to mention I have a lot of drawings of the characters and enemies. And if you've been on my channel for more than 5 seconds and go to my art videos, you already know my art style is not exactly the most perfect. To paraphrase 2 people, I draw very similar to Chris Chan. Odd that's happened twice. So basically, our 4 machines went through hell, and eventually by the time they get to Lust, they meet the current judge of hell, because remember by this point V1's already in Gluttony. They meet the current judge, Azrael. In Islam and Judaism, Azrael is the person who cuts the tie between the living and the dead. Basically, he would separate your soul from being alive to dead. And he had this, like, fucking dual scythe thing. I don't know how to describe it. And, like, the scythe was on fire. Like I said, this gets really edgy. And before the robots encountered him, another robot had already ripped off one of his arms. So he decided to take that robot's arm and use it as his current arm to wield his weapon. He was also blindfolded because I thought it looked cool. I don't think there's actually any lore reason. I have a picture of him without a blindfold, and he just has, like, really weird eyes. I don't know how to put it. I forget what my goal was with his eyes. I think I was trying to imply he, like, can only, like, see nothing, because I don't know. I thought it looked cool, okay? But anyway, he's pretty cocky. He's like, ha, machines, you're cringe. I'm gonna defeat you. And then one of our friends is like, nah, you're cringe, and then rolls a nat 20. That's a joke. We never even got to Limbo. Also, something else in our campaign that was kind of a flaw when looking back at it was that you didn't die, you'd respawn. But if you did die, you wouldn't be able to do anything until you got to the next area, because similar to ULTRAKILL, this is divided into like 4 levels each layer, and then the last one in each act being 2. Basically, if you die, you can't continue through the rest of the level and you lose half your money. Eventually, they would defeat Azrael, and then a shit ton of virtues and holy council members would show up, and this one angel who we unironically named Jeffrey. Basically, they're all sitting there yelling at Azrael saying, how could you fail? You're just as bad as Gabriel. Is there no true judge of hell? And then Azrael gets mad, yells at the robots, and then, similar to Gabriel, teleports away. After that, the players would have to run to the exit of Lust because there are so many virtues and angels that fighting them is just physically impossible. Get to Gluttony, go through it. I don't really think there was anything major. Something else I forgot to mention, I am really forgetting a lot about this campaign, aren't I? There were prime souls for each act. The first act was Hephaestus, the second was Midas, and the third was Prometheus, all from Greek religion and all of them having their own kind of little twists. I'll talk about Hephaestus first. Basically, in our lore, Hephaestus made the shells that demons inhabit. Because basically, fun fact if you didn't know, the demons in ULTRAKILL have flesh underneath their stone armor. It's just that nobody really knows where the stone armor comes from. The Leviathan's entry kind of hints that the stone shows up the same way the flesh does. But basically, in our campaign, the in-lore reason for the stone exteriors was that Hephaestus had a factory somewhere in hell producing these shells. However, God, getting angry at creating hell, got really angry and decided to banish Hephaestus down into Gluttony.
It's crazy that there's another prime boss in there, isn't there?
Hephaestus was also one of the lead people in heaven behind the design of the flesh prisons, meaning that he is responsible for the reason of why flesh prisons even exist. Upon breaking out, this was his speech. I'm going to attempt to voice act it. I apologize if you die of cringe. Fresh air. Oh, thank you, creatures of steel. I've been wanting to kill Father for his actions against me. He made me build those shells for those creatures he called demons. I built those shells, an entire factory to do it too. But you know how he rewarded my work? He threw me into my own prison. I built these machines of skin and stitch to keep the strongest of man trapped. But he threw me into here out of anger. I've heard there are the occasional moments these walls cracked open. And I know you want blood. I know it. So come forth and try to kill me. What? How can this be? Wait. It was foolish of me to think I could stop Father. If you ever find Father, tell him Hephaestus will haunt him in the void. And then they found some loot or something. I'll fucking... Anyway, before we continue on with the story, I feel like I should probably reference characters that will come in handy and what their role was. So let's take a break from the story for a second and talk about some characters. Other than the Prime Souls, another character was Asherah, who is God's wife. I don't think in the Bible God has a wife, but also I'm not Christian, so I don't know. But basically, she was God's wife, and when God went missing, she was so fraught with grief and horrified at the situation that she unironically cried so much that her body has now dried and turned into stone, or a stone-like material. And the whole idea was that there would be hints of her, such as in Prelude, near a fan you could hear crying, and the DM, my friend, pointed out that when they were near the fan, there was a faint crying underneath it. This crying being her. Another idea we had was presumably probably in like Wrath or something, for them to stumble upon her singing Silent Night. She was meant to more or less just show like God's actions have affected more than just the people of heaven. I don't think we had any big intention for her to like be a roadblock or cause trouble or anything like that. She just kind of existed. I don't know how else to put it. Another character we had, like I mentioned earlier, Azrael, who at first when my friend wrote him, I mean no offense, my man, I mean no offense, it was just Gabriel too. So I sat down, grabbed a drink, and wrote an entire story for this guy that was from when we meet him to when we finally see him, aka when he became the final boss. Basically, much like Gabriel, he starts out cocky and thinks he's hot shit, but upon the Holy Council finally demoting him, he begins to question God's faith. He still is Gabriel too. But instead of being like Gabriel and killing the council, he becomes a Satanist. There was 3 planned encounters with him. The first time we meet him, a time you meet him in Wrath, and then when we meet him as the final boss. Throughout all, in the middle of those encounters, there'd be hints and stuff about what's going on with Azrael. Upon finding him in Act 2, there's a lighthouse that summons what is essentially the Titanic of Wrath. I'll get into who operates it in a second. Upon talking to him, he states that a few virtues have tried attacking him, but now they've stopped. And he's questioning that if God made flawed man, then why even create hell if man is flawed in the first place? If you couldn't tell, I have a few critiques on religion, and I think I may or may not have been self-reflecting on this. But he basically says that if God made man flawed, why make hell to punish flawed man, if you made them flawed in the first place? A point that, if I'm correct, God himself brings up in the Testaments in ULTRAKILL. He talks about how he punishes man for desires, but angels also seek desires as well. What makes an angel and a sinner different? Now that I say this out loud, it sounds like I was the Satanist when I was writing this. I'd like to specify I have no particular religion or religious belief. I'm not a Satanist. It sounds like it when I wrote this, but I'm not a Satanist. But basically, there was like a thing where either if they tried to fight him, they would engage in a little fight. It would be easier, obviously, because he doesn't have his holy powers anymore. And he would yell at them and kind of just say, go to that Titanic ship that the lighthouse was summoned if you really want blood, and just leave me alone, and then he teleports away. And if we just talk to him, he just says the same thing, just not wanting to kill us. The lighthouse itself was kind of a big building. I don't want to say it was like a really large complex, but like it had a good few floors with some loot and some enemies in it. Using this lighthouse, you could summon the Titanic ship operated by the Red Ferryman. In ULTRAKILL, if you don't know this, the Skull Keys are dead ferrymen. They're from dead ferrymen, and their powers are what activates doors and allows ferrymen to guide people through hell. There's red skulls, which obviously means there's probably red ferrymen. Or Hikita just want a different color, and I look way too much into this all the time. But basically, upon activating it, a gigantic ship rises out of the sea in Wrath, and they find like a boardwalk or something to get onto it, where then the final probably like level or 2 of Wrath would take place on this humongous ship. The Red Ferryman, unlike other ferrymen, is just laid back and cool. Like, he doesn't care, if that makes sense, unless you try to fight him, which, knowing our friend group, to be honest with you, when me and my friend designed the prime bosses, we pretty much made them in mind with the idea my friends would find them, because it's like if they can get in a fight, they're probably going to take it. Now, if you remember earlier, we talked about that one angel we dead-ass named Jeffrey. His story is pretty autistic. Basically, he came down to the person who wrote the Bible and whispered to them in their dreams to write the Bible. Yeah, he also was like, you ever seen, like, back in the old days when during, like, a court session, somebody would have a typewriter typing what people were saying in the court? He also did that as his job in the Holy Court, And we had this idea that, like, he was, like, writing in a book everything that was being said as the council and Azrael are yelling at each other. And then at some point, presumably in Heresy, he tries to stop the machines by using a hell mech. Upon defeating him, he would drop a book, and when looking at it, it turns out he was just carrying a Bible on him 24/7. I wrote this. I fucking wrote this. Jesus Christ. Anyway, now that we're finally fucking done talking about characters, let me do a real quick summary of what Act 1 was, because all I did was just jump to Lust. Basically, Prelude was a separate mining facility, and down there they encountered a kind of subtype of machine called Scrapheads, specifically one called the Butcher. Scrapheads are kind of established in the Ultrakill lore, but the only example I think we know of is just sword machines. Basically, there were lots of subtypes of machines, like my character, that, similar to the sword machine, would build themselves out of scrap, but didn't build themselves into sword machines. After that, they would find a second entrance to Hell, even though it's heavily implied the one you see in Prelude is the only way into Hell. There was a lot of plot holes in this. They enter through this gate and fight a boss called the Slammer, who is this demon that essentially just had 2 Maurices for hands. They go into Limbo, and their mannequins would be there, but they wouldn't serve as a threat. When I wrote this, the teaser for mannequins wasn't out yet, by the way. It was meant to just kind of creep out the players, as the mannequins would just move and just seem to do things, but never actually attack the players. The most that we had after that was a giant dining hall, and rooms off to the side had books and loot, and the books explained, like, God's perspective on his creation, and, like, a letter he wrote to his wife before he left. There was also a reference to Jesus in there. Yeah, and it stated somehow Jesus ended up in hell. Why did I write that? After that, they would go to Lust, and there they would meet Azrael, obviously, but they would also start at the bottom, where there's the strong winds. They would either automatically somehow, or find, like, this equipment that would allow them to stick their feet into the ground and resist the strong winds. After that, like I said earlier, they'd go to Azrael, go into Gluttony. There was literally nothing eventful about Gluttony at all, minus them probably finding the Prime Boss. And finally, Act 2. Act 2 was probably the least established out of anything other than Act 3, which was purely just concepts. For Greed, an idea I had was like an oasis, but the liquid there wasn't actually water, it was like burning tar, and there was like special filth there that were covered in the tar and were immune to the heat. That was about it for Greed, I'm gonna be honest. Midas' story in this is kind of sort of different, not really. Basically, in the normal Midas story, when he finds out that he now has the ability to turn everything he touches into gold, he becomes regretful and is sorry for his actions. In this, he physically did not care. He was just happy he could get more money now. And God was so angered by the greed that he had that God literally sent an angel down to just kill him. And his punishment was to forever walk the sands of greed, where he would constantly have virtues watching him, and if he was to stop walking for even a split second, they would all blast him simultaneously, causing him immense pain. Eventually, he just stopped caring and just let them blast him to oblivion, to where eventually his husk then formed, his husk, because he was a king, being quite large. His husk eventually just slowly sank into the sand. The only thing left of it is 2 arms that partially stick out and half of his face. Somewhere in Greed lied his prison, probably like a temple or something. His flesh prison was a pyramid.
Get it? Because they're in Greed, and the punishment in Greed is to forever build pyramid. You get it? Do you get it?
And upon being freed, he gives his little speech much like Hephaestus. And I'm also going to voice act it again. I apologize for the cringe in advance, you can skip it. So this is what happened out here in this wasteland. I thought Sisyphus would have completed his little rebel fight. I knew that more I wouldn't be able to do it. Do you know why God killed me? And made everything I touch into gold? Out of anger. I was to quote, "The greediest human I've ever seen in the eons I've lived," said God. So he sent an angel to kill me. He made me walk forever, no breaks, just constant walking. Eventually, I just laid in the sand and let the sands take me. He got mad and then tried making me into gold. And now I'm free. And I'm still the same man he wanted to change. Come here, you bucket of bolts. Let me show you what being wealthy can do to a man. No! How can I fail? I'm Midas, the king of all. This is not fair. I'm the one who should have won. I should have won this. Not you. No. No. And then they got more loot. We didn't really plan what happened after the prime bosses. I think we just said, loot, yes. What's that? Letting them soak in the story? Nah, they need to be rewarded with loot. Anyway, after greed was wrath, and like I brought up earlier when I explained for several minutes all the characters, there was the lighthouse, the Titanic ship, the Leviathan didn't play a role because, like I mentioned earlier, V1's one step ahead of all of them. I think there might have been a part where there's like a flooded town and they had to navigate rooftops and occasionally go in through the houses. Yeah. Because remember, at one point, Wrath was the river Styx, not the ocean Styx. Heresy. I don't even think we planned anything for Heresy. See, Act 2 was, yeah, it was probably the least planned out of everything, and Act 3 wasn't even... Yeah, it was quite underplanned. Like I mentioned earlier, we didn't even get to Limbo because of how shitty everything was going and how shitty the friend group was. Act 3, Violence. Originally, before the teaser for Violence came out, yes, I've been working on this long, I had the idea of, like, each level being a different kind of trench, because in Dante's Inferno, one of ULTRAKILL's lead inspirations, violence is separated into 3 categories. Yourself, others, and God. After the teaser, I think we had rethought it about it. We kind of sort of rethought it, but like I said, this thing, it did not last. Next up, the actual custom layers we made with our own ideas of punishments and shit. Fraud was basically, for its punishment, people were farmers. Okay, let me explain. Basically, I had this thonk about if, say, the angels, the later ones up at least, are humanoid, do they ever get hungry or thirsty, you know, do they need food and water, do they need, like, luxury and stuff? So basically, the people in Fraud, their eternal torment is constantly being forced to create the things that heaven needs. And an idea I had that was kind of meant to emphasize this was that the animals down there that are used to cook the meat are clean, their little areas that they live in are perfectly clean, but you look at the fucking farmers tending to them, they're wearing ragged clothes, they have no eyes, they're missing teeth, their hands are stuck together with razor wire to prevent them from trying to climb, only giving them enough room to move their hands to mess with their tools. And the whole idea was that because the torment here is so easy to handle, there's like one virtue at every barn. Not like a shit ton of virtues guarding it, literally just a single virtue, just being chilling. And half the time the virtue would blast them for nothing but fun. The layer had this thick blue fog that covered the whole thing. Looking in certain directions, you could just see cornfields and wheat fields as far as the eye could see. The whole layer was more ambient and kind of less about combat and more about exploring. And there was also some ideas about having like stealth-based stuff in it to sneak into the barns. One of my friends, the one friend who played the scout robot, suggested maybe for later points in the session, before it was canceled, to have stealth, and I had thought of this idea of like a robot similar to the Sentry, and they just had a giant spotlight, and I had this idea that like they invaded a barn and there was a whole bunch of them just sitting there scanning for more blood. I didn't draw anything for it, so just cry. Here, this is probably what it looked like or something, I don't know. And eventually they would make their way down to the final layer, Treachery. Treachery was an icy swamp. The lakes were frozen, and the whole thing was relatively barren. While there was still enemies, the fights themselves were really hard. The entire layer itself didn't have a lot of enemies. My goal was, okay, and you can call me fucking edgy or whatever you want to do, because I agree, looking back, this is pretty fucking edgy. The whole idea was that it's so barren that I wanted the players to, like, reflect on their journey. Like, I wanted my friends to, like, reflect on what they did to get there. And down there was the third prime boss, Prometheus, who was, funnily enough, even though the final one, the first one we came up with. Basically, similar to, say, the Bible, he gave man fire, but God was not angered by this. He was happy. Man can now make fire and can cook meat. But there was something he did that angered God extremely. Prior to God going missing, he whispered to a scientist in their sleep how to create artificial intelligence. In their dreams, he told a scientist this, which is what led into the future when war was happening, them to create machines designed for war. God was angered at him for teaching man how to make life, because God himself, already angered at humanity, now saw humanity could make more life, and it could be even worse. And he was angered at this, and banished Prometheus down to treachery for betraying him. His husk was hung up by chains on a mountain, the mountain itself having a giant light and birds always flying towards it. Yeah, there are birds down here. I don't know. If anything, they would have been probably like flying demons or husks. And basically, the whole idea is he's been down here for so long that all the husks in treachery have ate the entire bottom half of his husk that's hung on the mountain. Only thing left being his torso and up that they can't physically reach. And his prime boss form also had a cut in the middle of his stomach to reflect this. Meaning his entire body was like floating in half, and we had ideas that like one half would attack and the other half would, but we decided to can that, which, what do you know, we ended up canning everything. Anyway, his flesh prison was hung up by wings. It would have probably just been easier to put a stick on the ground, we'll be honest. But anyway, it was to make his flesh prison unique and the fight more challenging because it could move around, yada yada. Eventually, they broke it open, and then he'd give his speech, which this was the first speech I wrote and honestly the most proud of, so this one is probably cringe to somebody, but I mean, I'm proud of it. Finally, freedom. Who are you? Actually, don't answer that. I know you. You are humanity's creation from me. I am the reason you stand here. I told them how to make fire, and then fake mines. A mine running through wire and code. But the Father was mad at me for such actions and banished me. Here. Your creation is what led to my imprisonment. You are the reason I am trapped. Father's creation was man, and I made metal. I gave knowledge for all. I gave enough knowledge to know how to make you, to how to make fake beings. And I know everything. And I know I'll make you into scrap.
Sponge, he's one tap. Do not fumble this.
I'm trying. I'm sorry.
I see I was no master of knowledge. I sat in this frozen cage thinking I would show Father how he's wrong. But it appears he locked me up, now to giving man knowledge. The fact I am a weak man. Father, forgive my creation. Man killed themselves, and I gave them the bullet for the gun to do it. I don't even think there was loot for this one. I think they just beat it and just sat there like, Poggers. Finally, they would continue through treachery, and then find a grand entrance into some weird place. Upon going in, they'd meet Azrael, except he now looks different. And by different, I mean he looks like something out of a goddamn emo teen's sketchbook. Wait, that's me. Here's this. This is what he looked like. And also, I agree, I can also hear the Linkin Park music in the background as well. Because in the ULTRAKILL lore, it has been established that Lucifer does exist. He is Lucifer's right-hand man now. Around this entire place is just dozens and dozens, perhaps even hundreds of dead robots just lying all over the place. And if we really wanted to pull off some crazy shit, me and my friend maybe even have thought of the idea that V1's down there now dead too. And basically, you're his next little meal. Except because it's 4 robots and because D20s exist. Basically, he was the final boss of the campaign. He was very difficult to fight. And he was just meant to be a very, very large challenge. Upon defeating us, he gives out a final speech. And he tells us that he's glad he at least died doing something he enjoyed. He realized he never liked working for heaven. And he's happy now to see that he can just die in peace knowing he helps Lucifer and enjoyed his time being with Lucifer. I'd like to establish that we were going to do sessions like once every week, so it would have meant that like this happened within the span of a few months, not like a day like ULTRAKILL happened. He tells us that we deserve what lies beyond, an ocean of blood, a place where we can forever refill ourselves and never worry about running out of fuel. Upon dying, he leaves behind a burnt cross. After that, they go out into the Blood Ocean. Yeah, that was the end of the campaign. Looking back, if I could continue it, and that friend group I was in at the time wasn't a toxic cess, I probably would have maybe had us go to Purgatory, because I really think Purgatory is an underrated part of the Divine Comedy by Dante. So, maybe they'd go to heaven and become gods. I don't know. But these are my ideas that I had for an ULTRAKILL D&D. The story. Let's go and talk about all the custom enemies I wrote, because firstly, with the enemies, I'll start out with Huss, then we'll move on to demons, robots, angels, and then a fifth category me and my friend came up with. And no, it's not other, it's not that. One of the very first custom enemies I thought of was a Huss called the Agonized. Basically, the enemy would roll a dice, and if it hit a number, I forget how it works, okay, I haven't played D&D in a good while now. When they hit the right number, they'd let out a scream, and the scream would stun the robot for like a turn or two, meaning they couldn't defend themselves. The whole idea, I think, was that, like, what layer were they meant to be? Judging by their blue skin, I think they were meant to show up, or, like, their home was from treachery, but I don't know. I think I just gave them blue skin because I thought it made them stand out. The healer is an enemy that we had thought of, which very similar to the soldier and stalker, has robot parts in it, now allowing it to do things. Basically, he would shoot out, like, healing goop, or something, I don't know. They'd shoot out healing stuff, or hell energy that could heal them, and it would allow the enemies to be healed in battle. He specifically could only do this to Huss and demons. The Minos Lover was an enemy that was to show up on Lust and literally nowhere else but Lust. I know one area we had in mind with it, and I forgot to mention this when I about the story, I deeply apologize. Basically in Lust, we had this idea that you could find a jump pad that would lead you on top of the King of Minos' corpse's city, because like by this point his corpse had moved and now his head was straight up, and you could jump on his forehead and go into these pillars, which turned out to be a little bit of some buildings with some stuff in them. The idea was that the Minos lovers just sat in there as not only a place of worship, but also to mourn over the death of King Minos. Minos, fucking potato, I don't fucking know. Another Huss that was meant to show up exclusively in one layer was the Sunken. They were meant to show up in a section in Wrath where they would have to go underwater. I don't know where, maybe it started underwater. They were part of the Solon that had managed to split away from the rest, and now are just kind of left wandering the abyss forever. I think they were basically just a reskinned filth, looking back. If you want to count them, the Red Ferryman was also technically a husk. Next up are the demons, and I'm actually kind of sort of proud of the designs I had thought of. The Bloater was similar to the Stalker, but slightly different. Basically, the lore behind these guys was that they were full of this toxic version of the Hell Mass, and they were ready to burst, hence the name Bloater. And upon exploding, they would let out all the goo. The goo, if it covered an enemy, would seep into their skin and turn their blood acidic, meaning trying to heal would instead hurt you. And the whole idea was you would want to take them out first over everything else. The Crusher, it's not Slammer, I apologize, I lied. He was meant to be the Guardian from Prelude into Limbo, and then was meant to show up later as just a basic enemy. I remember one idea I had for an attack of his is where he would spin around with his arms up and like you had to crouch or slide under him to avoid it. The Spinner, I think he just spun around and shot hell energy. I think that was really about it. The Spitter, that but just not covering a room. And the Stone Servant, I think it was basically just a demon version of a filth. I remember the lore was that they're looked at essentially on the same level as a filth, even by Huss, meaning they're like severely low on the rank of demons. Next up, robots. Earlier I mentioned the whole spotlight robot that was meant to encourage stealth. Another one we had was called the Miner, who was meant to be like a mining robot designed to help with mining the caves in Prelude. His purpose was literally just mining, and he even had those stick boots that they used in Lust. The Doctor is a robot that was designed as a field medic out in the human war, and instead has now repurposed his medical tools into healing robots. He was basically just the healer, but could only heal robots and nothing but robots. The Butcher was an idea I had for the whole subtype of scrapheads, in which basically he gave himself like retractable hooks for arms, and yeah, I don't know why his head is designed like that. I just had the idea of, oh, he's a scraphead, so his head looks fucked. Another robot idea I had, I might have the drawing. If you see it, you know I did. But basically, they were called the Flesh Prison Cracker, and they were a robot designed because... Okay, let's go. Explain this a little bit later. Basically, humanity found out flesh prisons exist, and we're designing a robot to try to crack open one. And then after that, we have angels, and they exist. Hadronials were very, very religious people in life, and now serve the purpose of being like guards in heaven. They had these like spiked flaming maces, I think, and the whole idea was that they had all these eyes and stuff, and even an eye on the back of their head, allowing them to be very efficient in battle. The librarian, I actually don't know what their purpose was. I think they were just literally the in-lore reason books are everywhere, but if the books are in hell, then how are the... Wait, what? I don't know. It was a dumb idea, concept design I had, and I thought it looked cool, so... I really don't know what they were meant to do in battle, I'm gonna be honest with you. Now, the priest, however, was not only a healer for the angels, but also was just overall a magic-based character and could use heaven energy to attack. Now, if you remember earlier, I mentioned a 5th species we came up with. It's gonna be edgy. Fallen angels were hell-based versions of angel characters. An idea we had was that the further they got into hell, the more and more of these angels they found. And by the time they reach treachery, all angels are replaced with fallen angels. The hellified version of a virtue was called the Fallen, hence the name Fallen Angels. The hellified version of a priest is called Liar. That name causes me physical pain. It's so cringy, it's so goddamn cringy. The hellified version of a Hadronial was called Imp. And for some reason in this category, although it's not at all related to fallen angels for some reason, an idea we had was that the worst people in the world, so people like Hitler, Stalin, all the other horrid people of the world, when they died, they became a Hell Knight. Basically, they serve right under Lucifer's wing, but however, to still cause them permanent torment, underneath their armor is flaming spikes, meaning they are constantly feeling a burning pain and also being stabbed, at the same time also working for Lucifer. So at first it may come off like they're Satan's right-hand man, when really they are in a constant agonizing state of pain. And that is it for the custom enemies. Anyway, I wrote terminals. For the terminals, I wrote a lot of cringe. The terminals themselves are very similar to the terminal data you can find after completing the prime bosses, because they are literally the same exact thing. They are found after beating prime bosses and lore can be read. The first one talks about humanity discovering the mouth of hell and finding out what demons are, describing the Cerberus and malicious face. And they also specify that upon studying them, being able to kill one with a lot of fire force, they were able to analyze the flesh underneath it and notice that the flesh comes from humans. Notably, the humans themselves are criminals or served in the war. Get it? It means the soul is turned into a husk and the physical person's turned into hellmash. It's totally not like at all me just throwing my theories into the lore. The second one describes the red doors and how humanity noted, because Hikita has hinted at this before in the past, how the red doors seem to exist for one person but not exist for another. They use drones to go into hell and study parts they physically couldn't reach, and they were able to get to gluttony but no further. And then there's the third one, and this is where it gets really fucking cringy. They found the entrance into P-1 and used street cleaners, and by that I mean even reusing an air cleaner, to burn the flesh around the doorway and then burn their way in. Because the flesh and even steel of that doorway would regenerate so quickly they needed constant fire on it to send a singular drone in. Upon going in through the tunnel and somehow, I guess, finding a way into the prime room, they discover the flesh prison, where it then promptly kills the drone, and then they lost their footage. And they state that they're building a robot to crack open a flesh prison to see what's inside. Eventually, at the end, Hell corrupts the message and just says, "I'm hungry." Anyway, yeah, that was the time me and my friend tried creating an ULTRAKILL DND. It went to shit because, like I mentioned earlier, we're not good at making everything balanced, making all the custom stuff. And the friend group that I was in at the time was a fucking piece of shit. If said friends are watching this, I could give less of a singular fuck. You can go fuck yourselves. But basically, yeah, that was the time we tried to make an ULTRAKILL D&D. It went to shit, but I don't want these ideas to just be left to rot. So, I'm glad I made this video. I could finally share them with the world and be laughed at, just like I laughed at them myself reading them. And, yeah. That was, What, do you expect there to be some fucking analysis or some bullshit?